They silenced my words, deleted my name, and thought I'd vanish, but they forgot I still breathed. That's what I whispered the day I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were trying to erase me. It started with the small things, as erasure always does. One picture missing from the shelf. One phone number mysteriously deleted. One voice, my voice cut off mid-sentence with a fake smile and a quick change of subject. My name is Alma. I'm 82 years old. And for most of my life, I was a storyteller. Not just a woman who lived through stories, but one who told them, who shaped them, who used her voice like a compass for others. For 35 years, I was the voice behind a quiet but beloved radio show. I gave the lonely company, the restless hope, and the broken-hearted a reason to keep listening. My words meant something, until, one day, to the people closest to me, they didn't. It began the day I moved in with my daughter and her husband. After my stroke, I couldn't live alone anymore. I believed I'd be safe there. I believed I'd be loved. Instead, I became a shadow in my own bloodline. They were kind at first, offering help, meals, conversation, but then they began replacing my presence with convenience. My books disappeared, my favorite records vanished. They took my phone, for safety. My emails were no longer mine. My name on documents faded into theirs, but I wasn't gone. I was watching, I was listening, and I was remembering. Because that's what women like me do. We survive, not by shouting, but by remembering every detail of what others want to forget. One night, I overheard my daughter talking on the phone. Her voice was hushed, but the words hit like thunder. She won't fight it. She's too old. Once we control everything, it's done. They were trying to control more than my finances. They were controlling the narrative of who I was. They had decided I was no longer useful, no longer credible, no longer needed. But that was their mistake, because a voice doesn't die when ignored. It sharpens, it waits, and when it finally speaks again, it cuts deeper than ever before. That night, I made a decision. I would not vanish quietly. I would not become a forgotten signature on someone else's future. I would not be silenced. And that's when everything began to change. Before we go any further, if you believe that every person, no matter their age, deserves to be heard, to be respected, to be seen, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just entertainment. They are warnings, they are mirrors, and sometimes they are maps to someone else's salvation. Now, I want to ask you something only you can answer. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing from the lives of those around you? Have you ever watched someone you love become invisible in their own home? Leave a comment below. Speak your truth. Because stories like mine aren't rare. What's rare is the courage to share them. Her name is Alma, 82 years of life, and every single one of them carried with a voice that once echoed through radios across the state. People used to tune in just to hear her speak. Alma wasn't famous by Hollywood standards, but in the small towns and winding roads of her region, her voice was comfort. Her stories stitched generations together. Her laugh became part of family routines, and her firm, warm tone had once calmed entire communities during storms and outages. She was a storyteller, a woman whose identity was carved not in gold, but in words. But time, as it often does, shifted the terrain beneath her feet. 8 years ago, she lost her husband. The silence he left behind wasn't just emotional, it was practical. He was the one who managed the logistics of life while she nurtured its meaning. For a while, she walked to the market with her little cart, sent voice notes to her loyal listeners through new apps, and replied to emails with the same curiosity she had when she first stepped into a studio. Alma was aging, yes, but she was living. Then came the stroke. It wasn't major, but enough to scare her daughter into action. Suddenly, Alma was moved out of her own apartment and into the guest room of a suburban home she didn't recognize as hers. Her daughter, Elaine, insisted it was for her own good. Her general Mark nodded silently, barely masking his impatience. They set up a single bed, a narrow nightstand, and a plastic chair by the window. But what disappeared that day was not furniture, it was Alma's autonomy. Within the first week, her phone was replaced with a basic one: no internet, no apps, no voice notes. Too many distractions, Elaine had said, while Mark changed passwords and deleted Alma's social media accounts. Her email, deactivated. Her bank app. We'll manage it from now on, Mom, Elaine insisted. as if Alma had suddenly become a child incapable of balancing a checkbook. She tried to push back, she asked, pleaded, then demanded to be allowed to access her accounts. But each time she brought it up, the room would fill with tension. Mark would raise an eyebrow, Elaine would sigh deeply, and the conversation would end with the words, "You need to rest. Stop stressing yourself." Then came this slow erasure. First, it was her framed certificates, her Lifetime Achievement Award from the Broadcasting Union, the photo of her first day in the studio, her signed radio scripts. She found them in a box in the garage under holiday decorations. Then, one morning, the photos disappeared. Her wedding picture, gone from the mantel. The group photo of her last radio team, replaced by a modern, abstract canvas. Even the bookshelf that held her memoir drafts was emptied out. "It's time for a cleaner look," said Elaine. The silence wasn't just digital anymore. It crept into conversations. They stopped asking her anything. They stopped listening. At dinner, they talked over her. When she tried to chime in, Elaine would say gently but firmly, "Mom, let it go," or worse, "that never happened." She started keeping stories in her mind again, narrating them silently while looking out the window. Then she found an old notepad tucked into a suitcase she had brought from her apartment. That became her refuge. She wrote everything down. Every memory, every odd interaction, every time Elaine dismissed her, every look Mark gave her like she was a burden. Her handwriting trembled, but the ink was sharp. Alma knew her voice hadn't left her. They had taken her microphones, her passwords, her place at the dinner table, but they hadn't taken her truth, and so she wrote. Quietly, every erased photo became a line, every silenced opinion became a paragraph. Every day they told her to stay quiet. She added another page. They thought silence meant surrender, but they forgot that silence can also be strategy. And now I ask, have you ever seen someone stripped of their voice while the world applauded the silencing? What if the person everyone ignores is the one carrying the most powerful truth of all? The moment Alma noticed her favorite blue sweater missing from the back of the closet, something inside her shifted. It was a subtle change, easy to overlook. But for a woman who had once mastered timing, tone, and the power of words, silence was never accidental. It was deliberate. First, it was her sweater. Then the silk scarf her late husband had gifted her on their last anniversary. The jewelry box vanished from her nightstand, and the books she loved, old classics, biographies, the kind that still smelled of libraries, disappeared, one by one. When Alma asked, the response was always the same: "You don't need that anymore." At 82, Alma had lived a full life. As a retired radio host, her voice once filled homes with warmth, guidance, and companionship. Her listeners wrote to her, cried with her, celebrated with her. But now, she was reduced to whispers behind doors, soft footsteps, erasing her world without permission. Her daughter Camila, who once clung to Alma's every word as a child, now walked through her life with a broom, sweeping away the essence of who Alma was. They started replacing her clothes with pastel-colored pajamas, not one or two, an entire drawer filled with bland, shapeless garments, as if preparing her for permanent stillness. Her elegant dresses were gone, her shoes replaced with rubber slippers. One day, she opened her wardrobe and found nothing that resembled the woman she knew. That woman, the one who wore pearls to Sunday brunch and red lipstick to the market, was being dressed in silence. Like a mannequin in a forgotten store, she wandered through the hall, looking for the framed portrait she had painted in her 30s. Once proudly displayed in the dining room, it was gone, replaced by a generic photograph of a mountain landscape. Alma's legacy, her identity, was being scrubbed from the walls of her own life. When she approached Camila, voice trembling, and asked about her belongings, the response came with a smile too tight to be kind. "We're just decluttering, Mom. Less is better now. You'll feel lighter." But lighter wasn't the right word. Alma didn't feel lighter. She felt invisible. Even her contact list on the phone, a device she had mastered before most her age, was mysteriously reduced. Friends she hadn't seen in years suddenly stopped calling. When she finally got the courage to ask why Miriam, her best friend from youth, hadn't replied to her birthday voice note, Camila casually said, "Oh, I deleted those numbers. You were getting confused." Confused, Alma was many things, but she knew her mind better than they gave her credit for. The stroke Matov softened her speech, but her mind was still sharp, still capable, still hers, or at least, it had been. One night, when the house had fallen into the thick silence of sleep, Alma stood before the bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. Gone was the lipstick, the earrings, the scarf, but the fire that stubborn flame behind her tired eyes still flickered. She reached for her purse, found a small travel-sized lipstick, and with slow, deliberate strokes, wrote on the mirror, "I'm still me." The next morning, it had been wiped away, but the message lingered in her bones. Then, she heard it. From behind the slightly cracked door of her daughter's bedroom, Camila's voice cut through her heart like a blade. "Once we get the legal guardianship, she won't be able to stop anything. She doesn't have a say anymore." It wasn't a whisper. It was certainty. Alma stood frozen in the hallway, her hand gripping the wooden doorframe. They weren't just tidying up, they were dismantling her existence, one item, one memory, one right at a time. That night, Alma took out an old notebook from beneath the mattress. Her hands shook, but her mind was steady. She began writing. Not about what was taken, but about who she was. Names, places, stories, favorite books, songs, dreams, her life on paper. If they wanted to erase her, she would leave ink in her place. Every page she filled became an act of resistance. Every memory recalled became a stone laid on the path back to herself. They could strip her walls, toss her dresses, delete her friends, but her truth had already taken root. And now I ask you, have you ever felt someone try to shrink you down, erase what made you, you? At what point do we stop allowing it and take our voice back? Let's talk about it below. The air in Alma's room was always unnaturally quiet. It wasn't the comforting silence of peace, but the kind that echoed absence of laughter, of conversation, of presence. Ever since her daughter Helena and son Noel Gregory took over her life, every trace of who she once was had been systematically removed. But Alma, 82, wasn't just a woman with silver hair and soft hands. She had been a voice, a real one, a radio host in her prime, with words that moved people, that reached hearts through static and distance. And that voice, though buried, hadn't died. One rainy afternoon, while rummaging through the bottom of an old cedar chest, Alma found something that sent a jolt through her veins. Her old voice recorder. A bulky, dusty relic from a different time but functional. Her fingers, though slower now, found the familiar buttons. Play, rewind, record. She pressed the last one and sat quietly for a second. "This is Alma Rivera," she whispered, and for a moment, even the rain seemed to hush. From that night forward, every evening after her caretakers slept, Alma spoke. To herself, to the future, to whoever might one day care enough to listen. She documented everything what they said, how they dismissed her, how they changed the locks, controlled her meals, erased her presence. She told stories from her past, too, about her youth, her first time on air, how her late husband used to say she had a voice that could calm thunder. She hid the recorder beneath a loose floorboard in her closet, tucking it away before sunrise. It became her secret, her resistance, her voice, quite literally, coming back to life in the shadows. Weeks passed. Her room became her stage again. The quiet returned each night, not as defeat, but as invitation. She spoke softly, but with conviction. In those recordings, she didn't sound like someone fragile. She sounded like Alma Rivera, the woman who once read poetry 2000s through a microphone and made people believe in beauty. Then one day, everything changed. It was a Saturday. Helena had taken Gregory to a spa retreat, leaving a young caretaker named Marco to watch over Alma. Marco was new, gentle, curious. He had grown up listening to old radio shows with his grandmother, and something about Alma intrigued him. Her poise, her distant eyes, the way she whispered to herself when no one was watching. While cleaning her closet, Marco accidentally stepped on the loose board. It gave way with a soft creak. Curious, he lifted a hand. There it was, the recorder. He didn't press play immediately. He asked her first. "Miss Alma, ... what is this?" Her eyes met his. For the first time in weeks, her lips curved into a faint smile. "My voice," she said, "the one they tried to bury." Marco hesitated, then pressed play. Her voice filled the room. Not the broken, quiet voice he had heard around the house, but strong, wise, and unshakable. Alma telling stories. Alma documenting injustice. Alma breathing life into every syllable. Tears welled in Marco's eyes, not just because of what she said, but because of how familiar it sounded, how it reminded him of his grandmother, how wrong it felt that someone with such richness Such soul could be dismissed so icily. Why didn't you tell anyone? He asked. Because they wouldn't have listened. But I will. Alma touched his hand gently. Then don't let them erase me. That night, Marco copied the recordings onto a USB, made backups. He started transcribing them. He even uploaded one anonymously to a community forum for elder advocacy. And people listened. They commented. They cried. They recognized the voice. Alma Revereth, the radio host from years ago, alive, fighting. The whispers grew louder. The posts spread. People began asking questions. Helena returned from her trip oblivious, until she noticed the printer in the study spewing out pages of transcribed audio logs, until she noticed Alma sitting taller, smiling more, until she heard her mother's voice echoing from Marco's laptop. Alma wasn't silent anymore. Her words were out there. Her truth was breathing. And now I ask you, how many voices like Alma's are being silenced in plain sight? How many stories are erased before they can be told? Maybe it's time we started listening before it's too late. What would you do if someone tried to erase the voice of the person who once gave you yours? It began with a shaky hand and a memory too powerful to stay buried. Alma, whose voice once filled radio waves with stories, warmth, and wit, now found herself confined to the four corners of a silent room. But what they didn't realize was that her voice had never truly vanished. It had only been waiting for the right moment to rise again. The old recorder, worn from decades of use, but still reliable, held within it the fragments of Alma's soul. Each night, under the soft rustle of bedsheets and the hum of a distant television in the living room, she would whisper truths into its microphone. Today, they gave away my photo albums, she'd say, voice trembling but fierce. My name wasn't on the mailbox anymore. They said it didn't matter. Her words were not complaints. They were records, testimonies, evidence. Her grandson, Matteo, a boy of 16 with curiosity sharpened by love, had stumbled upon the old recordings while helping clean out the garage. He hadn't expected to find much. But then he pressed play and his world changed. There was something in his grandmother's voice that struck deeper than sadness. It was a quiet storm of resilience, of refusal, of pain turned into purpose. Matteo listened to every tape, one after another. He heard her talk about how they took her clothes, her contacts, her past, how they made her feel invisible, but also how she refused to disappear. He heard her say, "They think silence is peace, but silence is where injustice hides." And something in Matteo's chest burned. Without telling anyone, he'd packed the recorder into his backpack, biked across town, and knocked on the door of a woman he had never met but had heard about in one of Alma's old stories. Her name was Rosa, an old colleague from the radio station. Alma used to say Rosa was the best producer she ever worked with, sharp, brave, and loyal. When Rosa opened the door, Matteo introduced himself with the only words that made sense. "I think my grandmother needs her voice back." She raised an eyebrow. He handed her the recorder. She pressed play. Within seconds, her hand flew to her mouth. "Alma," she whispered. The voice coming from the device was unmistakable. What followed wasn't a plan. It was a mission. Rosa didn't hesitate. She called in a favor at the local station where she volunteered on weekends. A small, community-run frequency but powerful enough to reach thousands of radios across town. That Friday, during a late-night slot that usually played reruns, Rosa uploaded a segment titled, simply, "A Voice You Forgot." The audio began. "My name is Alma. You may not remember me, but I used to speak for others. Now I speak for myself." And then came her recordings, raw, undiluted. People in their kitchens stopped washing dishes. Drivers pulled over. Elderly listeners sat up in their recliners. Something about that voice, aged, tired, but blazing with truth, cut through the static of everyday life. By morning, the town had heard her. Neighbors began calling in. "I know that voice. That's Alma. She used to tell bedtime stories on the radio. What happened to her?" It wasn't long before the clip began to circulate outside the station. Snippets of her voice were shared at senior centers, community groups, and even by teachers in local schools. Discussions began about respect, about dignity, about the way society hushes those it doesn't want to see. Alma, without ever leaving her bedroom, became a beacon. She didn't just regain her voice, she lent it to others who had none. People began to write her letters. Strangers left flowers on the front step. Young activists quoted her. One local poet read her words aloud at a city hall meeting. The message was clear. She would not be erased. And neither would anyone who carried her story. What about you? Have you ever felt someone try to silence your truth? Would you have the courage to speak louder, or help someone else be heard? Leave your thoughts below. Alma hadn't stepped inside a radio studio in over a decade. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what this moment represented. The walls, still lined with acoustic foam and nostalgia, welcomed her like an old friend. It wasn't just a return to a physical place, it was a return to herself. She had once commanded these airwaves with grace, power, and wisdom. And now, after months of silence, manipulation, and erasure, her voice was about to rise again, not in secret recordings or whispered words, but in full volume. It had all started with a single clip. Her former colleague, moved by the raw vulnerability and resilience in the audio the grandson brought, had aired a short segment during a late-night program, just a minute and a half. Alma's voice, once familiar to thousands, crackled through the static, saying, "I'm still here. They tried to erase me, but I remember who I am." Phones lit up, emails poured in, social media erupted. Listeners from all walks of life, some who remembered her from decades past, others who had never heard her before, were united by one thing: they felt her. Her words weren't just sound, they were truth wrapped in pain and defiance. The station, flooded with requests, invited Alma for a special live session. A tribute, they said, a homecoming. But word got out fast. Her daughter, the very person who had tried to control her narrative, suddenly appeared with protests and legal threats. "She's not well," she told the station. "She's confused. You're exploiting her." The radio manager, however, had heard the voice, had seen the glimmer of clarity, fire, and truth in Alma's recorded words. And more importantly, so had the public. The studio received messages from community leaders, activists, and former listeners demanding that Alma be allowed to speak. She had become a symbol of all the voices that had been muted, hidden, or dismissed with age. She wasn't just Alma anymore. She was every silenced elder. When the day came, Alma arrived, not in silence, but in quiet strength. Liam, her grandson, walked beside her, holding her hand with pride. She wore her old studio pinna, small microphone made of Bresson. Her coat, her hair was pinned back, her eyes firm. Her daughter tried one last time outside the building. "Why are you doing this?" she hissed. Alma turned to her calmly. "Because I still have a story to tell." Inside the booth, Alma sat in front of the microphone. Her fingers traced the buttons she once knew by heart. The red on-air light blinked. The host gave her a nod, and for a moment, the world stood still. Then, her voice flowed. "Good evening," she began. "My name is Alma, and yes, I'm still me." She told her story, not with bitterness, but with power. She spoke of the quiet erasures, the humiliations disguised as care, the isolation masked as protection. She spoke of the lipstick on the mirror, the recordings in the night, the soul that refused to shrink. Her voice was no longer just sound waves, it was fire. As she spoke, phones rang nonstop. Social media exploded with the hashtag Voice of Alma. Old listeners called in with stories of how her broadcasts once helped them through grief, loneliness, and despair. Young people shared clips, calling her a warrior. A movement began to rise, and the full audio of her live session became the most downloaded segment of the year. Podcasters requested interviews. Advocates for elder rights quoted her words in conferences. And most touchingly, elders across the country began recording their own stories, inspired by Alma. Her voice had become a ripple that refused to fade. At the end of the session, the host asked, "What do you want people to remember from this, Alma?" She paused, smiled gently, and said, "That silence is not peace. That forgetting someone doesn't make them disappear. And that one voice, no matter how old, can still shake the world." The segment ended with a slow fade of her final words, as a gentle piano played in the background. She walked out of the studio not as a guest, but as a storm. If you've ever felt your voice being drowned out, your truth being pushed aside, or your worth measured by someone else's standards, then ask yourself, what would you do to take it back? Alma walked through the entrance of her new home with a grace that defied the years they tried to steal from her. The community was filled with color, laughter, and walls lined with the echoes of stories long buried by silence. It wasn't just a residence. It was a sanctuary of voices, of brushstrokes, of music that danced through rooms like sunlight through old curtains. Here, every line on a face was a badge of resilience, every wrinkle a chapter. Alma was not just a guest, she was a revolution in motion. The old microphone, polished with care, stood tall in front of her. With one breath, she reclaimed not just her past, but the present they told her she no longer owned. The red on-air sign lit up. Her voice didn't tremble. It roared softly, firmly, like the ocean remembering how to kiss the shore. Alma walked through the entrance of her new home with a grace that defied the years they tried to steal from her. The community was filled with color, laughter, and walls lined with the echoes of stories long buried by silence. It wasn't just a residence. It was a sanctuary of voices, of brushstrokes, of music that danced through rooms like sunlight through old curtains. Here, every line on a face was a badge of resilience, every wrinkle a chapter. Alma was not just a guest, she was a revolution in motion. The old microphone, polished with care, stood tall in front of her. With one breath, she reclaimed not just her past, but the present they told her she no longer owned. The red on-air sign lit up. Her voice didn't tremble. It roared softly, firmly, like the ocean remembering how to kiss the shore. Alma walked through the entrance of her new home with a grace that defied the years they tried to steal from her. The community was filled with color, laughter, and walls lined with the echoes of stories long buried by silence. It wasn't just a residence, it was a sanctuary of voices, of brushstrokes, of music that danced through rooms like sunlight through old curtains. Here, every line on a face was a badge of resilience, every wrinkle a chapter. Alma was not just a guest, she was a revolution in motion. The old microphone, polished with care, stood tall in front of her. With one breath, she reclaimed not just her past, but the present they told her she no longer owned. The red on AIR sign lit up. Her voice didn't tremble. It roared softly, firmly, like the ocean remembering how to kiss the shore. Alma walked through the entrance of her new home with a grace that defied the years they tried to steal from her. The community was filled with color, laughter, and walls lined with the echoes of stories long buried by silence. It wasn't just a residence, it was a sanctuary of voices, of brushstrokes, of music that danced through rooms like sunlight through old curtains. Here, every line on a face was a badge of resilience, every wrinkle a chapter. Alma was not just a guest, she was a revolution in motion. The old microphone, polished with care, stood tall in front of her. With one breath, she reclaimed not just her past, but the present they told her she no longer owned. The red on-air sign lit up. Her voice didn't tremble. It roared softly, firmly, like the ocean remembering how to kiss the shore. They called her forgettable. They tried to replace her with silence. But now, with the world listening, Alma's voice became a mirror to every person who had once been told they didn't matter. And as she signed off with grace, her words echoed in the hearts of thousands. They tried to erase me, but I was the story all along. What would you do if someone tried to erase your legacy? Comment below and let the world know, because your voice might be the spark someone else needs to rise. There are wounds that don't bleed. They hide in silence, in words left unspoken, in doors that close without reason, in eyes that look away when what we need most is to be seen. But there's one thing that neither time nor neglect nor even the most subtle cruelty can erase: the soul of someone forged in pain and reborn in courage. Alma, with a name that means soul, proves that the truth can be silenced but never killed. It may be forgotten by others, but not by the one who carries it in their chest with dignity. Her story isn't just about resistance, it's about rebirth. When they tried to erase her identity, they underestimated something crucial: the strength of someone who has already faced life with both feet in the fire. Alma had won battles long before this one. She had built a family, spent sleepless nights caring for others, swallowed her words in the name of peace. But when she realized they were trying to silence even her very existence, something inside her stirred. It wasn't a cry of despair, it was a call of faith. It was the living memory that she was still breathing, still thinking, still feeling, and that was more than enough reason to fight. You don't need youth to have power. You don't need a crowd to make an impact. Sometimes it starts with a single voice, a forgotten recorder, a message written on a mirror with lipstick, and suddenly, silence begins to echo. The invisible begins to shine. The one who was erased begins to be remembered. Alma taught us it's not about shouting louder, it's about speaking the truth with steady conviction. It's not about revenge, it's about justice. It's not about going back to the past, it's about honoring it while building a new future. Many of us have felt the pain of being ignored. We've heard words that shrunk our worth. We've stood in places where we became strangers to our own stories. But there's a turning point for everyone. A moment when the soul wakes up, when tears turn into strength, when shame gives way to inner authority. Alma lived that moment, and with it, she reminded us that there's still time for any one of us to rise. No matter how hard they've tried to erase us, there will always be a spark left to reignite the fire. There will always be a microphone waiting for our voice to finally reach the world. Her story doesn't end in silence. It ends in purpose, in action, in faith, because God doesn't abandon the forgotten. He lifts the humiliated. He uses those who've been dismissed to show the world what dignity truly is. Alma became the instrument of a greater message. No one has the right to define the end of a story that God is still writing. And when He breathes life into a new beginning, neither the past, nor the fear, nor the rejection can stop the harvest of honor that comes after. And now that you've heard this story, maybe you realize it's partly your own. Maybe there's someone in your life being silenced. Maybe it's you who needs to remember who you are. Maybe this is the sign you've been silently praying for, the confirmation that it's still possible to rebuild, even when everything seems lost. Don't ignore that feeling, because the world needs your voice. It needs your example. And more than anything, you deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, hit that like button now. Subscribe to the channel so more voices like Alma's can be heard by thousands. And get ready, because in the next video, you'll meet someone else who was buried under lies, but found light where there was only darkness. Don't miss it.